So I think different than some of the talks that I'm sure you've heard today, I don't come from traditionally from the education industry. And so what I'm going to talk to you today about is adventure, taking risks, and generally being in the outdoors as a method for learning and getting to know more about yourself. And I think personally I've learned more from nature than I have from my professional and education, strictly classic education career combined. So a bit of an introduction. I'm only going to talk for about 15 minutes, and hopefully you guys can ask me some questions. So from the beginning of time, man has always been fascinated with the idea of pushing the envelope. Not literally, of course, but really trying to redefine the limits of what's possible, trying to be the strongest, the fastest, trying to go to the highest place, the coldest place. And this was always clear in the field of exploration. In 1978, a famous climber called Reinhold Messner not only succeeded in climbing Mount Everest, but he did it without the use of supplementary oxygen and completely on his own. Two things that were considered impossible before that time. And in 1961, Yuri Gagarin defied Earth gravity to complete one orbit around the Earth for the first time. Again, something that was considered impossible in those days. But that spirit of pushing boundaries, of doing the things that at one point we thought were impossible to do, transcended into many fields. In the arts, Mozart, from a young age, redefined the way we communicate and interpret music, effectively reinventing his own classical genre. And in this part of the world, Al-Khwarizmi invented algebra, which is single-handedly responsible for numerous applications that we interact with in our everyday life. It is my belief that that spirit of pushing boundaries, of doing the things that we thought once impossible to do, is the single biggest catalyst behind human advancement and evolution. And in some ways, it's one of the biggest opportunities for growth for us as individuals and obviously students as well. My name is Omar Samra. In a former life, I used to be an investment banker and a private equity professional. I did my MBA at London Business School, and then about 7-8 years ago, I left all that behind and started this company, which basically specializes in getting people closer to nature. We focus on many things. The main thing that we focus on is kids from age 6 to 16, and trying to break down those walls where children or adults have this fear around nature, because there's so much learning that can happen, and there's so much self-discovery that can happen if we do that. Another project I'm working on back home is trying to build the country's first adventure mountain park, and also an opportunity for families and children and students to come together and interact in this environment. But if you can't remember any of those things, just remember me as the guy who specializes in dragging himself and heavy objects to high and cold places. This is a photo of me taken up in the Peruvian Andes, climbing a mountain. This is one trying to climb down that same mountain. And one of my favorite photos actually was taken in Indonesia, in an island called West Papua, with a bunch of friends, as you can see, wearing very little clothing. I was once asked in a very serious TV interview, the guy looked at me deadpan and asked me, "Which person are you in the photo?" Which I thought was pretty surprising. What was more surprising is 2 weeks later, an article ran with the same photo, and the caption read, "Omar Samra, second man from the left," which I thought was kind of flattering in a way. On the 17th of May of 2007, I succeeded in becoming the first Egyptian youngest Arab to reach the top of the world. That was a lifelong dream for me, something that I thought about when I was 16. But things weren't all rosy. It all started actually when I was about 11 years old, when I was diagnosed with severe chest asthma. I was born in Wimbledon, even though I lived most of my life back home in Egypt. And I was born roughly around the same time as the tournament, which my parents, very optimistic, thought, well, if he was born roughly around the same time as the tournament, he's going to be the Egyptian version of Boris Becker. Now, unfortunately, I was terrible at tennis and pretty much every sport I played until 11, when I became severely asthmatic. I used to wake up every night unable to breathe properly. In fact, my breathing got so bad I started to sound a little bit like this guy. My parents obviously worried, took me to a doctor. He said, Omar has this peculiar kind of asthma. It will disappear in his 20s, but if he wants to do something about it, he should learn to play sports very seriously from a young age. And so I would wake up 2 hours before the school bus arrived, and I would go running. And then within weeks and then months, my lungs expanded. I started to stop using some of the inhalers that doctors had prescribed. For the first time, I could play traditional sports. And then something happened at the age of 16 that sort of changed the course of my life for the years to come. And that is, I had the opportunity of going to Switzerland and climbing a very small mountain. In fact, it was the first time I'd ever seen snow. But I remember being taken back by the mountains, by the beauty of it, the sense of peace that I found when I was there, but also the sense of challenge. Because when you climb a mountain, you don't necessarily challenge the mountain or the elements. You're challenging your own weakness of the body and mind to achieve that goal. And the whole idea of setting goals for yourself and setting challenges for yourself and going through all these steps necessary to reach that goal. It has a huge amount of self-fulfillment, even if you're not able to reach the goal itself. And so basically, I embarked on this 12-year-long journey climbing progressively harder mountains all around the world until Everest became sort of a logical path. Since we're short on time, I wanted to actually, through some of the experience that I've lived, I wanted to take a lesson from each one, which was very useful for me. And I think it really underscores the idea that we can learn so much from nature. It's something that is free, that is out there. It's the biggest school that is there for all of us. And I think there's so much to do if we immerse ourselves in nature, immerse our kids in nature, students, and so on. One of the lessons for me was on Mount Everest. My expedition to climb Mount Everest lasted for 65 days. It was about 7 weeks into the expedition. We had reached Camp 3, which is the final point you reach before you start embarking on the final summit attempt. And every single day on Mount Everest, you start in a camp and you need to get to the next camp. But sometimes you can't see, mostly you can't see where that camp is because it's hidden from view. On getting from Camp 3 to 4, which is where you go for the summit attempt, it was very different. You could actually see about 80% of the route from where you are. And that was pretty bad because your movement was very slow and far between. So without any exaggeration, you'd basically hold the ice axe in your hand, you take a step, and then you take another step. And a week before, a man from another team had died. This whole thing was weighing on our minds. I had lost 12 kilos on this expedition. As you can see, I don't really have 12 kilos to lose. And about 2 hours into that day, I was just exhausted, so beaten down. I looked back and I could still see camp. It wasn't very far. And I was just about to give up. I was just about to quit. But at that precise moment, I remembered something. I remembered there was only one guy at the time that I knew that had climbed Everest. And before I went on this expedition, I went to see him, that he'd give me this golden piece of advice that would take me to the summit. And so it was in the UK. I was doing my master's at the time. I had to travel 3 hours outside of London to meet this guy. And eventually I got there. I was pretty anxious. I had so much to do to prepare. And we were obviously having tea, and it was was taking its time. And then eventually we got to it, and I was like, let's get on with it. What's that golden piece of advice? And again, he just looked at me like deadpan, very serious, and he just said, just keep putting one foot in front of the other. And I thought that was the most rubbish piece of advice I was ever given, because he could have just picked up the phone and told me that on the phone. But I remembered that piece of advice right there at that precise moment when I was going to quit. And I asked myself, can you take one step? Yes, I can. Can you take another step? Yes, I can take one more step. Because invariably, unless my legs were broken, I could take that one step. And I asked myself that question 1,000 times that day and took those 1,000 steps. And something magical happens when you do that. You somehow realize that the only thing standing between you and reaching your goal is your mind telling you that you can't do it or making excuses for yourself. And so that day, we actually managed to get to Camp 4, and then, following day, managed to reach the summit of Everest. And the video here is those final steps that we took to reach the summit. And so it's a very, very simple concept, but it was so profound. Most lessons and learning in life are actually quite simple. And so the first lesson from Everest was to just keep putting one foot in front of the other. The second thing actually came in the Arctic. After I climbed Everest, I went on to climb the 7 summits, which is the highest mountain in every continent. And then I set myself a challenge of doing something called the Explorer's Grand Slam, which is something only 40 people have done, which is climbing the 7 summits and then skiing to both poles. I had skied to the Geographic South Pole, and then the last challenge was to ski to the North Pole. I don't know if any of you have been to the Arctic, but it's a pretty desolate place. Mostly it looks like this. The sun is very low in the ground. It's very, very cold. It's very humid. And it's always just kind of a horrible place to be in, really. When you're in the South Pole, skiing to the South Pole, you're actually skiing on solid ground. There's about 3 kilometers of ice under, which is actually the continent underneath. In the Arctic, you're not skiing on that. You're skiing on about 30 centimeters of ice that are floating on top of this 3-kilometer deep freezing Arctic Ocean. And so there's a huge sense of fragility. You're eating, sleeping on this thing, and it's sometimes, because of climate change and what have you, sometimes there's breaks in the ice. Sometimes these gaps are much, much wider. We actually have to wear dry suits and get into the water. But the really big lesson for us, and I think I have just actually one photo that really shows how horrid the conditions are out there. But the biggest lesson for us was that one day, it was about halfway into the expedition. And of course, in the North Pole, in the Arctic, everything looks exactly the same. So there's no sense of progress. Even when you get to the pole, there's no pole at the pole. It's just the same. And so there's nothing waiting for you when you get there. And so, we start on that day. We tie the sled that weighs about 70 kilos. It's got all our equipment and the supplies. There's a rope attached to a harness, and we start skiing for about 8 to 10 hours a day. Through battling, high winds, cold. You get 10 hours later, you get to your destination. You think. You take out your GPS because it's the only way that you can find out where you actually are. You look at it and you realize you're not 20 kilometers north from where you started that day. You're actually minus 3 kilometers. So you're not even at 17, you're actually minus 3, just because the wind decided to blow in the wrong direction and the ice has drifted the other way. And so it's an extremely demoralizing prospect when you've actually done everything that you can. You've worked so hard, and there's so many parallels to this in our life, where you've done so much and you're not even a little bit short of your goal, you're actually even further behind from when you started. And if you actually hold on to that idea, it can completely break you down and the whole expedition is over. And so the way that we managed to get through that was just through a very small mental transition, which is, in life, if you look at how vast the universe is, if you look at how vast these conditions are and all these things that are completely out of our control, 99.9% of things are. But if you actually start to worry and hold yourself responsible for the things you have absolutely no control over, you get into this really bad mental zone. But if you just simplify everything and you just focus on the only things that you do have control over, which is what choice you have to do to act right now, and what you choose to do with whatever you're feeling right now. And so you wake up every single morning and you just make one promise to yourself, which is, today, I'm just going to do my absolute best. No one was ever going to be able to ask me to do more than my best. I can never ask myself more than to do my best. And if you can just commit yourself very gently, without putting too much pressure on yourself, is to just wake up every morning and just do your best. Whatever your best is that day, that was something quite transformational for us. And we using that, we were able to get past the hardest parts of the expedition, reach the North Pole, and complete the Explorer's Grand Slam that I told you about. The third lesson comes from a pretty unlikely place. After I had finished the Explorer's Grand Slam, I had wanted to pursue, for me was a childhood dream that I think many of you here have had maybe when we were about 6 or 7, and it's the idea of going to space. As an Egyptian, we don't have a space program. There's no direct route to going to space, so it's a really, really far-fetched dream. And as I was dreaming of this as a kid and growing up as a teenager, everybody around me, including the closest people to me, were telling me that you need to forget about this. This is not something that is even feasible, and so on and so forth. And I was just basically indoctrined almost for many, many years to completely abandon this dream. And when I thought, of course, going outer space is impossible, let me just direct my attention to whatever I could explore on Earth. Something did happen. This was in 2013, something changed, and a competition was announced where the winners would win an opportunity to go to outer space with one of those new commercial spacecraft institutions. And so that was quite revolutionary for me. I was very excited. I knew that there was going to be 23 winners. That's a huge number. And then 2 weeks later, I found out that 2 million people applied, so I was a bit deflated, to be honest. It took me about 9 months to go through the first process of the competition. I qualified. I was in a group of 110 people. We were sent to Cape Canaveral and Orlando. They put us through 6 grueling challenges. There was sort of ground school challenges, which were mainly fitness tests and G-force centrifuges. There was flight schools. We went on parabolic flights where we did zero gravity tests, and we did sort of acrobatic maneuvers with fighter planes. It was all out of my comfort zone, but in the end, I was the only Egyptian, actually was the only Arab to win out of the 23, and that was back in December 2013. And I haven't gone to space yet because we're still waiting for the launch time, because they're still working on the technology, which is this Lynx Mark II, which is going to be one of the first reusable spacecrafts, which is supposed to take off from a normal runway, go up to 103 kilometers above sea level at 3 times the speed of sound, and then land back on a normal runway. Because it's completely reusable, it should decrease the cost of spaceflight by about 100-fold, which is going to be revolutionary. It's going to do for the space industry what modern flight did in the 1920s to make it very prevalent and something that is accessible to all of us. And so the lesson that I had learned, well, first of all, since I'm Egyptian, I put this in a pyramid, but there's about 4,000 people in the world who've climbed Mount Everest, 400 people who've done the 7 summits, and less than 40 people who have completed the Explorer's Grand Slam. Hopefully, if I'm able to go to space, I would be the first person in history to have completed these set of challenges. And so coming from a background when I was young, when I was 7 years old, thank you, appreciate it. Thank you. Coming from a background when I was about 7 years old and told continuously on and on and on that this is something that you shouldn't think about, it's not logical, just you're spending too much of your time on something that is not really achievable, I actually managed to put this thing together. It hopefully will unfold, and I think that no one can be the judge of your true potential. I don't think you can even be the judge of your own true potential unless you try. Most of the people who don't achieve anything in life, it's not because they've tried 10 or 100 times, it's because they haven't tried at all. The last thing, going back to Earth, is I think something that's very important as well to teach our students, to teach our kids, even from a very young age, the idea of giving back. Once we have achieved something, once we have learned something in our lives, there is a responsibility, there's a real responsibility to try and see how can we take those experiences, these skills that we've learned, and do something about it. And from my experience with the whole space industry recently, I've realized that this is something that is very underdeveloped in this part of the world. It's an industry that's growing, probably one of the fastest growing industries in the world right now, will continue to be so for the next 30 years. And it's extremely important in this part of the world that we are part of this mission. And the way it starts with our kids. So I worked with a group of people for about 2.5 years. In the end, we managed to launch this program called Fada'ak, which makespaceyours.com. You're welcome to visit the website if you have time. And it's the first space science competition in the region. We've started with Egypt across schools and universities from age 8 until undergraduate age. The school kids get the opportunity to to write a paper about what kind of spaceship they could build to go to a new settlement. It could be Mars or a new moon, or what kind of settlement would they build on this sort of planet or a moon of their choosing. And they have to look at things like energy, they have to look at food, they have to look at all the life support systems that they can. And it's amazing because we've already started this and we've had so many applications. And recently we had our first batch of winners, and one of them was about 8 years old and came with a fantastic paper about how life could be on Uranus, for example. And the most exciting part is actually the university competition, where we're basically having kids in universities submit ideas of space experiments, and the winning idea we'll have developed into an actual experiment, which will be put into a payload and hopefully will go with me into space. And so then you have a situation where a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old kid or a group or in a team have come up with an idea that's been developed into an experiment that's actually gone to space to hopefully answer a question that we don't know the answer to, and therefore they're contributing to the body of science, and therefore breaking down those stereotypes that I talked about. And these are just some photos of, this is a grassroots project that we started with no huge backing, and we would go and get these venues from universities, and with very minimal marketing, we would just fill just massive halls with hundreds and hundreds of people, just to show you, how much energy there is and how much drive for these kids to learn about this really exciting field. We also launched some space camps as well, and we managed to graduate a couple of batches of kids. These are kids from age 7 to 11. And so basically lesson 4 and the last one is that once you've done your thing and as you're doing it, and I think it's really important kids that understand from this age that they need to work on themselves to reach their full potential, but they also need to always be mindful of how they can use their experiences to give back. I said in the beginning that this presentation or these slides are basically a story of how nature, adventure, risk-taking has been the fundamental tools that I have used in my own life to learn about myself and to learn about the world. And I think that outdoor education, which is a field that I'm now working in, is very underrated. In many countries, you see this as a founding block of education. In the States, you have outward bound schools that focus primarily on outdoor education, how they can use outdoor education to teach multiple lessons and multiple skills. And this is very largely absent in this part of the world, and I think it's extremely important. One of the things that humanity has lost is its connection with nature. And when we're disconnected from nature, we're disconnected from ourselves. And so extremely important, not for kids to go out necessarily on these extreme adventures unless they really want to, but just to have a closeness to nature, to look at nature as a friendly place that they can interact with. And because when you're in nature, something magical happens and you get this clarity of mind and you're really able to think clearly and really communicate with who you really are away from when you're in the cities and there is so much mind chatter going on. So anyway, that's my story. Thank you very much for listening. I see we still have about 8.5 minutes if someone is interested to ask a question.
I'm a doctor, basically. I'm Dr. Arkira. Tell me, what made you to reach your destination? You told that your mind. Do you feel that, which is the catalytic agent for mind to act for?
What's the last part, sorry, you said about the mind?
What was your, let me tell you, what was the catalytic agent which made your mind to work to impossible?
Well, I think it's very simply, it's all the things that I did is just, I did them because there's things that give me joy. And I think in a way, getting joy out of things can be an end in itself.
Is motivation and optimism also along with the joy, I feel? It was your motivation that made you there.
I think the motivation comes from, there has to be, initially when you do these things, when I wanted to climb Everest, when I was very young, it was very much of an ego thing. I wanted to prove to myself that the same asthmatic kid that was 11 years old could stand on the top of the world where there's very little oxygen. And then, with time, this changed, and you develop, what motivates you and what gets you out of bed is because you believe that the things that you're doing make you happy, but they're also an opportunity to hopefully inspire others as well.
But it was optimism always there, that was the case. You're optimistic about it, isn't it? So medical science, now we are focusing, because it is optimism. It's optimism, it's the role of a hormone, endorphin, which makes you optimism, and that you could do. That was my contention. Yeah. Optimism.
I think optimism is important, but I think it's important to embrace the fact that that life is cycles, and just to understand that everything is impermanent. So sometimes we feel down, and eventually we're going to feel better. Sometimes we're up, and not to hold on to that when we're also up, and we'll go down.
That's right.
So.
That's right. Thank you.
Please. Yeah, I actually have, and so there was always this thing when I climbed Everest back home, because I was the first one, even though it was something that had been done many times before. People always got to this idea of like, you've climbed the highest mountain, there's nothing else out there for you. And then I would do something else, and then every time I would get hit by this, you've done everything, there's nothing out there, almost like, okay, now you should sort of retire or whatever it is. And I think you could always, that is the case if you always think about challenges in a linear fashion, like you're doing something, like a mountain, you need to do something higher, you're doing something, you need to do something harder, and then something harder, and so on. But I think that sometimes if you take things out of the physical realm and look at it from the point of view of your own fulfillment and learning. And so I don't necessarily have to keep pushing the boundaries in that linear way, but as long as I'm putting myself in experiences that are outside of my comfort zone, and by definition, when I'm outside of my comfort zone, my learning curve is going to be higher. I'm going to learn much more about myself and so on. And so now what I'm trying to do is throw myself into things that are completely new to me. For example, on the 12th of December of this year, hopefully myself and a teammate will be embarking on an expedition to row across the Atlantic in a two-man rowing boat. I've never actually rowed in my life, but I'm going to learn over the next 9 months, and hopefully I'll be able to do it, or at least give it a go. Because at the end of the day, I think one of the things that I was trying to mention is a lot of people measure success with reaching the summit, getting to space, doing all of these things if these are my ambitions. But actually, I think that if we wake up, like I was saying, if we wake up every single day and commit to doing our best, and we actually do that, then we've already succeeded. Whether we reach the goal or we don't, that's something that is largely outside of our control. And so a lot of the times, and I've been guilty of this throughout my life, is a lot of the times we're extremely hard on ourselves. The world is pretty tough a place as it is, and there's no need for us to be even more hard on ourselves, because most things are actually really outside of our control. But if we just focus, get laser focused on the things that we can control, I can control my actions. I can decide if I want to lift this up or put it down. I don't even have control over my emotions, because we're a body that is a mixture of chemical reactions and electromagnetic currents. Sometimes I'll feel sad and I just don't understand where it's coming from. But I have a choice of what to do with that feeling. And so by being present in the moment and just dealing with whatever is happening and when you're in the moment, you are infinitely powerful, because you are completely in control of your destiny. But we sometimes get bogged down by thinking too much of the past or worrying about what's going to happen in the future, and that sort of takes energy away from us doing what we really need to do. And so just by really simplifying things and just trying to enjoy life and going out there and just doing our best, that's all that we need to do. Yeah, and then I think if we're less hard on ourselves, things tend to flow easier, and resistance from things that usually have caused us a lot of problems tend to sort of dissolve. At least it has been in my experience.
Another question. I'm sorry, I don't know if you addressed this in the beginning, but what do you find in a school setting when you expose children to some of these outdoor, outward bound type activities? Does that have any relation to their performance within the classroom?
I think so, because it's most of these things are related to are behavioral, and they're related to character building, and they're related to teaching them self-reliance, and self-reliance is very much interlinked with self-confidence, self-esteem, and so on. And it's certainly something that we've seen, and it doesn't take even weeks and months to see it. In a sort of a wilderness camp of like 2-3 days, you'll see certain kids that are struggling or causing certain issues, and within 2-3 days, it's either we will see it directly or we'll have their parents come back to us after these 2-3 days have expired and said, I don't know what you've done, but there has been a massive change. And I think it's because sometimes in traditional sort of education system, at least if I talk about, because I'm not from the industry in a classic sense, but I went through school. A lot of the time I felt disempowered. I was basically just somebody visiting in the class. I was given stuff. I had to learn the stuff. I had to get good at sitting an exam, but I don't have any my own power or my own identity has sort of been taken away. But when you're in an outdoor setting and you're given responsibility and you're given challenges, whether it's challenges that you're doing yourself or taking care of other members of your team. The last speaker here was talking about the idea that everything, even in the classroom, has to be translated into something practical, into a project, into something like this. And then when you go into nature, everything is a project, everything is a challenge. And you're constantly dealing with all these discomforts, you're out of your comfort zone. And I think by challenging yourself in this way, and getting to see nature as this, not as this sort of scary kind of place, but this place which is an opportunity for you to better yourself. I think the benefits can be quite phenomenal. Thank you.
Hi, you speak so well, almost like a poet.
Thank you.
If you were to write a book about your adventures, what would you call it?
I don't know. It's I think maybe something like embracing uncertainty. Or one foot in front of the other.
Maybe this is the last question.
Sure.
Some of the things you said, I look back into my childhood, and there are a lot of missed opportunities. But you have that great advantage, and I'm speaking as a teacher. You've been through some great exercises, which basically talks more about collaboration and teamwork, climbing up the summit, or crossing over the North and the South Poles. Have you gone into schools, like schools in Egypt, and have you volunteered to take some young people, 17-year-olds or 19-year-olds, and actually formed a team to take them to some places like this? Because the youth needs to know, the youth need to know more about sustainability, global warming, and people like you can actually I know you're venturing out across the Atlantic and some great stuff, but I think it's more important for you now to connect with young people and show them what
Yes,
our
absolutely.
environment's all about.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there was a question here about, so what's next? And I think what's next, and has been for the last 2-3 years, is this idea of now how can I take everything that I've learned and hopefully give back. And so my company had started as an adventure travel company, and then about 3-4 years ago, we became very serious about the element that deals with kids from the age of 6 to 17. And then we started developing programs, and we have done what you're saying. We have done it multiple times, and we constantly, I've probably given over 200 talks across the country in very even underprivileged places. The space competition that I talked about, where we tried not to stay in Cairo and Alexandria and the big cities, but we went to Upper Egypt and to some of the smaller villages. Yeah, I mean, I think that's crucial. Because the benefits are there. It's actually something that's scientifically proven, but even though we're approaching it more from a practical approach. Thank you. Thanks everybody.